My last tip. As you enter a public-private dialogue, think how you're going to end it up. The same way you want to start thinking about where you're going to host it, how you're going to structure it, depending on who's going to be implementing what. Here, you want to enter thinking about what's the end of the life of that public-private dialogue. And it's very important to look at the perception of people, because people have different perceptions wherever they come from. Like here we had a donor representative saying about one particular case, we've been supporting this public-private dialogue for 5 years. It's about time we get out of it. Especially with the upcoming elections, the things, are getting too political for us. At the same time, a private sector representative was like, a dialogue has been working. Why do they want to stop the sponsoring? When they're just starting to get results. And you're going to find that kind of different dialogues between different people of the private sector having different views, different people of the government having different views, people between public and private sector. And so it's important to kind of consider why the private sector dialogue is there at the first place, and is it an initiative that's going to go, is it an institution that's permanent? So it depends, of course, and let's consider this image of the public authorities on one side, the private sector on the other, and there is a gap, right? If there were no gap, we will not try to institute a public-private dialogue. It will already exist, be rooted into the institutional process, into the fabric of the country, but it's not there. There is a gap. So what do? You put a little bridge, because that bridge is going to enable you to talk, going to enable you to get things done. And so you have a champion, you have instruments that get there together. They bring the public authority and the government and the private sector together. You remember the PPD diamonds, you have those prerequisites, so they put a little bridge in there. But on a bridge, you can only put small issues, because the bridge is not very strong. So you build a better bridge over time. It grows. Now you consider the 12 dimensions we've been talking about, and you've improved over those 12 dimensions. You've improved your outreach, you've improved your monitoring and evaluation, your budget management, the people, the systems, the outputs, the filtering mechanism, the tracking mechanism. All this is now quasi-scientific. It's working well. You've done it with low-hanging fruits, and now you're doing it with big issues. But it's still a bridge. There is a limit under, of the weight it can take. What if you were actually filling the gap and passing that machinery that you build in that public-private dialogue, that know-how you had doing that bridge? What if you were using the same engineering within the institutional framework, within the fabric of the relationship between the public institutions and the business associations? Then the heavy trucks could go on that road without having the fear of the bridge collapsing. And so this is kind of why the public-private dialogue is there, and how you need to consider what its usefulness, and at what point does it stop, what point does it start, By looking at many of those, we saw a number of phases. We saw 4 particular phases, and on this graph I put you 3. And at the beginning, on the first phase, it lasts from 1 to 3 years. There is low results, early results. It's a trust-building exercise. People are starting. It's an education process, a discovery of what works, what doesn't, and we start to set up small production process. How do we churn up actions and reform? Who decides? How do we filter? You're testing all these things. You understand the people who want to participate, the people who don't want to participate, the people who are committed and not. Where does it work better? It's the early results phase. Often for country-wide dialogue process or things that are new, it lasts from 1 to 3 years. And then you get to phase 2, which is higher impact results. There's more capacity. There's a better production system. Therefore, there is a better product, better actions. But because the stakes are higher, there is more conflict. And because there is more conflict, the results going to fluctuate a bit more. Some working groups going to disappear. Some new working groups going to come in. And that constant bargaining is happening. What you see in Turkey, where you have this kind of permanent committee that I talked about, the yoke before, there is plenty of working groups, but it changes all the time. Every year there are working groups coming in, going, coming, going. Constant bargaining. And then you have the last phase, after another 1 to 3 years. The best case scenario is when this capability that was put in this ad hoc public-private dialogue is rerouted to the institutions and to the business membership organizations, like in the picture I showed you before with a truck going on a road, because this engineering capability has been rerouted to where they should have been at the first place. But it doesn't always happen that way. Sometime the sponsors, the champions, the people who were providing the instruments in the PPD Diamond, they go and they say, well, no, the public sector and the private sector together, they can match up. We've done our role of helping out. We are moving out. But the capacity of those actors is not there yet. And so it might go down and die from a relatively slow death. Not great to watch. Sometime you can have a permanent brokering, and this thing gets going for a long time. It can happen, why not? Sometime it stops, because the people involved in the dialogue don't want to let it go for a long time and lose their energy. They just say, we stop it now, we'll remember it for what it is. Now, of course, a lot of fluctuation in that model, right? And it's not like that every time. It's just we try to put in graphs some very complex contextual realities here. But it gives you an idea as to where maybe you are in the dialogue that you're involved with today. Just a little bit of issues about people like the World Bank Group or other donors, development partners, whether they're multilateral or bilateral. And a donor can also be an agency within a country that helps develop a sector through a public-private dialogue in that sector. You got to look at what is sustainability, and you got to discriminate between operational sustainability, financial sustainability, sustained mandate and effectiveness, and how to consider all those different things. And so if you do that, you got to look at the different options for transitioning out. And you do this in steps, and you do this very carefully. You don't just sponsor a mechanism and just let go, But I don't want to focus this too much on the role of the donors in this. I want to talk about how you have a fourth phase in those dialogues. And this is something that we saw when we were doing this study on the Mediterranean region by looking at 10 cases, 5 in the citrus sector, 5 in the cruise tourism sector, and 10 of local economic development in Catalonia, where we saw that, as you see during the birth, development, and maturity phase that you see at the bottom, the PPD Diamond kind of shifted sometime between a very strong sponsorship. This is in the case of the mold makers in Valles, where you have a technology center that was created, and a mold maker association and a cluster of people doing foundry and molds. And you find that over time, it really shifts, and there is at some point some kind of another fourth phase, which is kind of the capture phase, or the exploitation phase. It's the dialogue sometimes is there as a thing for the sake of itself, and it can be used by people who see it working well, and the dialogue achieved its goal, but either the politicians jump on the bandwagon and are going to try to use it for political means, or private sector are going to try to use it for political means. And you have sometimes this fourth phase of exploitation by one or the other of the participants. And if you look at dialogue processes 10, 15 years, and if they have not been rerouted to existing institutions, very often they're driven by particular people for particular reasons. So you got to look for this fourth phase, and I invite you to read about it in that particular study we did on publicprivatedialogue.org, the Mediterranean study. Very interesting results. Now, of course, all those tips I gave you about managing public-private dialogue and the lifespan of those and all those things, you know, public-private dialogue is not an end in itself. It's not supposed to be there forever, and you got to consider it in the context of other reform initiatives. When I say it's not supposed to be there forever, I mean this relationship between public and private sector needs to be there forever, but the mean to do it might evolve over time. That particular initiative with the secretariat and working group, that particular cluster that you put together with a number of private sector actors, that particular roundtable you created, doesn't mean it's going to be there in 20 years from now. It doesn't need to be. You got to look at the entire institutional framework and the entire number of things that are happening. There are special economic zones, there are clusters, there are value chains in which the SMEs and the multinationals might be interacting into. There are reform units in governments that come and go with different governments. There are regulatory simplification programs, you know, about the regulatory impact agencies and the regulatory review process. This is a great way to integrate public-private dialogue into that. And there are a lot of open governance initiatives about opening the budgets, opening information, open data so that the citizens can engage with the government, and that's a new way to do public-private dialogue, and you don't need to sometimes mediate it by specific institutions or initiatives. You can have this direct linked. So you've got to consider this entire space.